Chapter 12. Chet's Ruse. Back at the old car, Chet was still asleep, but Mystery greeted Frank and Joe with excited yapping. "What? Who?" grunted the fat boy, starting up and blinking. "Are we still in Forestburg?" While he sat rubbing his eyes, Frank and Joe, grinning, climbed into the front seat of the car. "Are we in Forestburg?" repeated Joe with mock disgust. "We've only been here 2 hours, that's all. And listen to this." He related what the brothers had learned. Chet was astounded, and also disappointed, to have not been there to hear his friend's discoveries firsthand. Meanwhile, Frank had been poring over a road map. Now he started the car and headed out of town in a westerly direction. "Say," Chet exclaimed, "where are we off to now?" "Riverville," Frank replied, and he explained that Clatch's carnival was there. This back road should take us to the place in half the time that the highway would take. With an injured look on the broad face, the stout boy sat back and folded his arms. "So you just walked out on me. You two just wait. I'll show you who's the detective around here." "Well, wait," Joe chuckled. Captain McGuire's old car seemed well suited to the narrow, badly rutted road. Maneuvering carefully to avoid holes, Frank drove past the dense woods that lined both sides. Sometimes the road followed a stream, at others it ran along ridges. There were no buildings in this area. "We must be getting close," observed Frank, looking at the speedometer. "But what a place to run out of gas." No sooner had the youth spoken than the three friends, rounding a turn, came upon a station wagon parked on the left side of the road. The hood pointed skyward. Across each fender leaned a man in blue dungarees, his head almost invisible under the hood as he peered at the motor. "Let's see what we can do," said Frank, pulling over. "We have plenty of time." As the boys stepped from their car, a huge dog bounded swiftly toward them. "Uh-oh," said Chet hastily. "Better stay inside, Mystery." The big dog gave a curious, but not unfriendly sniff at Frank's outstretched hand. At the same moment, one of the men raised up. He was bony and had red hair. "Here, Blue," he called, and turned to greet the boys. "Don't you fellows worry about Blue. He won't bother anybody." "What's the trouble?" Frank asked. "She conked out somehow," the man answered with a perplexed grin. "It just won't go." Joe was already peering at the engine. "Mind if we have a look? My brother and I have done a bit of work on motors." "Help yourself," invited the other man, who wore a loud print shirt. "Gotta do something. We can't stay here all morning." Somewhat puzzled at the helplessness of the two men, Frank and Joe rolled up their sleeves. "Got any tools?" Joe asked the man. "Nope," the red-haired one answered. "Wouldn't you just know it?" "Have much trouble with her?" Frank inquired. The man scratched his head and grinned. "Well, now, I can't say 'cause she's not mine. I just borrowed her, you see. Out to deliver these apples." "Apples?" Chet beamed, and he strolled around to the back of the station wagon, which was open. There, under a tarpaulin, were several bushel baskets of big red apples. "Mind if I try one, mister?" "Go ahead," the bony man called. Thinking that the second basket held juicier fruit than the one near the tailboard, Chet chose his apple from there, but as he brought his hand out, he noticed that there was no fruit underneath, just something wrapped in brown paper. Instantly, a wave of suspicion flooded Chet's mind. What could the two men be hiding under their apples? The stout boy pondered for a moment, remembering the hijacking near the state line. Munching loudly, he strolled back forward toward the others. A sign, "Kendrick's School for Boys," caught his eye on the station wagon door. Continuing to munch idly, Chet managed to bump into Joe, who was bringing a wrench over from Captain McGuire's car. "Oof! Look where you're going," he said loudly. In an undertone, he added quickly, "Pretend you need a part and send me to town for the police." Joe gave no sign, but went back to work. Still chewing, Chet strolled near. "What's the pitch here, fellas?" he complained. "I'm dying of starvation." Joe's calm voice replied from under the hood. "Well, pal, you'll just have to starve a little longer. We need a new condenser for this motor. How about running to town to get it?" "Me?" Chet feigned indignation. "Why should I run the errands?" "Okay, forget it. But you could get yourself some lunch in town." As Chet ran toward the car, the red-haired man and his partner chuckled heartily. 15 minutes of fast, bumpy driving brought the stout boy back to Forestburg. Entering the familiar wooden courthouse, Chet made straight for Sheriff Ecker's office. "Not you boys again," said the sheriff, who seemed even busier and more weary than before. "Look, son, I just don't have time for you now." "You will when you hear this, Sheriff," was Chet's quick answer. "I think we found a couple of your hijackers. Better come and look at them anyway." "What? Where?" The sheriff stood up so fast his swivel chair rolled rapidly backward. "Stalled about 2 miles out of the old Riverville Road. My buddies are keeping them there." While the amazed lawman listened, Chet told him his suspicions. Even as he was speaking, the sheriff picked up his telephone. "Give me the headmaster at Kendrick's School for Boys." Shooting fast, direct questions, the sheriff got his answers and relayed them to the waiting Chet. "He says they never lend their station wagon. It's the only one they have." "See if it's there now, will ya?" he asked the headmaster. In a few minutes he had his answer. "Gone! Stolen!" he told Chet, hanging up. "They just noticed it. Looks as if you might be onto something, boy. Are they armed? Did you notice any weapons?" Chet shook his head. "Nothing but a big dog. And that could be pretty mean if it wanted to." After calling 2 regular deputies into his office, Sheriff Ecker explained his plan. "We'll wear our street clothes, boys, no badges. I'll take my personal car. We'll approach from the direction of Riverville. This boy here will be standing in the middle of the road, so we'll have to stop, and then we'll arrest those men." Meanwhile, Frank and Joe had continued to tinker industriously at the motor of the station wagon. The red-haired man and his helper seemed to grow less friendly as time passed. They continually looked up and down the road. At last, Captain McGuire's old car came into sight. Chet got out with a gleaming bunch of yellow bananas in one hand and a box containing an automotive part in the other. "About time!" shouted Joe, who was feeling the tension. Unconcernedly, Chet handed over the part, peeled himself a banana, and then planted himself in the middle of the road munching to watch the work go on. The 2 men watched now with worried faces. "Of all the dunderheads!" Frank suddenly exclaimed in disgust. "This condenser isn't even for this make of car. Can't you ever think of what you're doing? It's too small." "No good?" demanded the men in chorus. "We'll try to make it do," Frank grumbled. Beep, beep, beep. A brown, weather-beaten sedan, with 3 men seated together in the front, had approached quietly from the direction of Riverville, and was now honking impatiently for Chet to move out of the road. "Okay, hold your horses," he said. "I'll move." As Chet sauntered back to the stalled auto, but unnoticed by Frank, Joe, and the suspects, 2 men had stepped from the sedan and come over. With drawn pistols, the deputies moved into position behind the red-haired man and his partner. "Raise your hands," ordered one quietly. "Turn around and don't try anything. You're under arrest." Caught completely off guard, The men did as they were told. Meanwhile, the third man, Sheriff Ecker, who carried a large net under one arm, went swiftly to the back of the stolen station wagon. He ripped off the tarpaulin and heaved out the apples and shouted, "Furs! You were right, son! Look at these!" The excited sheriff carried an armload of rich, expensive furs. Frank and Joe, with greasy hands and faces, merely stared from Chet to the sheriff to the captives in amazement. "You'd better talk," Ecker warned the men as he checked a notebook. "These furs were stolen 3 months ago from a truck in Jersey. You've been hiding them until you thought the heat was off. They're concrete evidence against you." For answer, the bony man suddenly uttered a sharp command. "Blue! At 'em, boy!" At once the huge hound bared his teeth and advanced ferociously upon the 2 officers. But at that moment, the sheriff raced up and hurled the big net over the raging animal. In a moment, with the Hardys' help, the dog was helpless. Why, you fat—" began the raw-boned, red-haired man in a rage. Chet Morton, however, merely looked at Frank and Joe with a satisfied grin on his face. "All right, fellows, who's the detective now?" he demanded. After handcuffing the prisoners securely, the officers led them to the sheriff's car. "Nice work, boys," Ecker said. "I'll get back to town. I have to report the recovery of these furs and the capture of these men to the FBI." The sheriff and one of the officers put the prisoners in their car, while the third officer drove the station wagon. The boys said goodbye and continued on toward Riverville. "You get all the credit this time, Chet," Joe praised his friend. "You'll be getting places as a detective." On the outskirts of town, Frank stopped at a telephone booth and called Fenton Hardy at the State Police Barracks, just over the New Jersey line. He told of Captain McGuire's disappearance and the hijacker's capture, and then continued, "No news of Captain McGuire yet, Dad, but we're following a new lead right now." "Good work," he said, "and give Chet my congratulations." The boys started up once more. "The carnival's on the edge of town," said Frank. "Not so fast," Chet spoke up. "Lunch first." "Who's the detective around here anyhow?" "Okay." It was more than an hour before Frank, Joe, and Chet entered the midway of Clatch's Carnival for the 3rd time. A friendly ticket-taker directed them to the small blue house trailer parked behind the tents where Colonel Thunder performed his act. Frank knocked. As the man looked at them inquiringly, Frank put the question, "Pardon me, sir, but aren't you William Donner?" End of chapter 12.